From a psychological point of view, there are only two things in the world. There's either straining to enact our agenda or letting go. Now, we obviously think that there's a hell of a lot more things in the world than that. But if we're to cut to the chase, then what we would discover is that there are only these two things, that's all. And it's handy to see this. It helps us to see through all the dead wood. And there's an awful lot of dead wood. Everything's kind of dead wood, really. If we could only see that it's either one or the other, that would clarify our situation for us. So just to go through these two possibilities. The first possibility I mentioned is the possibility of being in that mode where everything is about enacting our agendas. And when we're in this mode, which is the linear mode, we can call it linear because it's based on an indefinite extension of our present viewpoint. We're only seeing things in terms of our present viewpoint, and we imagine it's the only way to see things. So our world is actually made up of nothing else but this present viewpoint. So when we are trying to enact our agenda the whole time, then there's only two things can happen. One is that we successfully enact the agenda, which is great. That's considered to be the best thing. And then there's the possibility where we don't enact our agenda. And that's a rotten thing. That leaves us feeling very crappy, very bad about ourselves. We feel like losers because we can't enact our agenda. And if we can't enact our agenda, what does that say about us? You'd be walking down the street and people would look at you and say, look, they'd say, there goes a guy who can't enact his agenda. What a waste of space. What a loser. That's the definition of a loser, is someone who can't enact their agenda. Clearly, it doesn't matter what your agenda is as long as you can enact it. It doesn't matter what your goal is as long as you can realize it. And if that sounds a bit simple-minded, it's because it is. It's a much more useful thing to be able to question one's agenda and so as to reflect on it, say, hey, what the hell am I doing with this agenda? Where does it come from? What's the point of it? What good will it do anyone if I do enact it? So then you could be a person who can question their agenda. Hey, here's a person who can question their agenda. And that's a really great thing. But we don't celebrate that. As I've just said, we don't celebrate people who can question their agendas. We celebrate people who can enact them, because that feels much better to us. That feels very positive to us. So from a psychological point of view, there are various mind states that occur within this modality. But all of the mind states come down to either positive anticipation that we will be able to enact our agenda, or looking back retrospectively speaking and saying, yeah, all these times I was able to enact my agenda. And so all of that makes us be in a euphoric mind state. And so we feel good about ourselves. Now, we don't really, this isn't a reflective state. It's purely based on the fact that the universe up to this point has not stopped us enacting our agenda. So we feel cocky and sure of ourselves. We feel like the bee's knees. So we're kind of like this shiny ego that hasn't had any dents in it yet. And so the other possibility is where we still believe that enacting our agenda or making our dreams come true, or whatever type of language you would like to use for it, is the be-all and the end-all, the standard by which to measure ourselves. But for whatever reason, we've had a run of bad luck, or there's some kind of glitch inside of us, so we keep self-sabotaging ourselves. So for whatever reason, when we look forward with this dread and anticipation of not being able to enact our agenda, and we look back and we think, oh God, I've never been able to do anything right, and I'm always messing it up. And this gives rise to the other type of ego, which is an ego which has become cynical, an ego which doubts itself, and an ego which hates itself, because egos are not very tolerant. There's no room for failure in an ego's vocabulary. If you can't make the grade, then that's it. Off with you. You're not worth a damn. You're not worth a fart. I've got no time for you. No such thing as second best. And that is how we see things. And then, of course, we turn that around on ourselves if that happens to us. So we do feel really bad about ourselves. Now, when we put it like that, all of that business does sound a bit superficial. And it is very, very superficial. There's no depth or nuance to it at all. It's very, very simple-minded. And yet, even though we can see that, that doesn't stop us from carrying on with this linear way of looking at things. So in mental health, and in the world of mental health providers, or whatever you'd call it, facilitators, mental health and workers, we're very much in the linear, because we're always talking about the importance of goals and how important and fulfilling and empowering it is to obtain goals. Now, from the point of view of the mind-created self, this is a perfectly legitimate thing to say. It is important. And to the extent that we are content to live life in this modality, then this is a legitimate approach. But this isn't the only modality. There is another modality available to us, and that is the modality of the non-linear, the modality of growth. And we all say growth is great and celebrate growth, but at the same time we talk about achieving our goals, setting goals and achieving our goals, having the confidence to set them, and whatever it takes to achieve them. At the same time we celebrate our growth or possibility for growth, as if the two are the same thing. But linear progression or development is never the same as growth, because it simply involves the perpetuation of the current viewpoint. So it's an extension of what is, forever and ever and ever. on and on and on, like a train track with no other destinations. It's just a perpetuation of the same mind state, or a perpetuation of the same ego state, if you want to put it like that. So definitely no growth. Where growth comes in is in the other modality, the other possibility, which is letting go of our agendas. And the reason we let go of our agendas is because they no longer seem so great to us, because we've been able to reflect on them. And as soon as we're able to reflect on our agendas or on our goals and let go of them, we've grown. So that's a kind of a back to front kind of a thing. And that's the reason we don't generally get it. That growth comes through letting go, not through holding on. When I let go of my agendas, and this doesn't mean that I deep down think it would be great if I could get them, but I've had the stuffing knocked out of me, so I'm not going to try anymore because I don't believe that I'm able to, but I still wish I could. That's just an embittered, disillusioned ego that has taken up the loser role. What it really means, obviously letting go of our agenda, just means letting go of it. It doesn't matter anymore. It's no longer seen as important. And the thing about letting go of agendas is that when we let go of our agendas, we're also letting go of the one who has the agenda. To go together. So really, that's the reason we find it so hard to let go of our agenda, because in doing that, we're letting go of the particular ego state of which that agenda is a extension or projection. So that's why it's hard to do. Our love of goals is our love of the ego state which has those goals, because the goals are an extension of that ego. Now, unless that letting go can happen, there can be no meaningful change. There can be no meaning at all, because whilst achieving goals might seem meaningful, it's only meaningful in a very, very narrow sense. It's meaningful within the framework of the game that's being played, but the game is awfully sterile. And so just because something is meaningful within that sterile game doesn't mean it's meaningful. The only meaning that the psychological ego knows about is the meaning of perpetuating itself or proliferating itself. But it itself is meaningless in the sense that it's only a game. So we can play it at the game as if it's meaningful, think this is very meaningful, but it's only a game that we're thinking that. In itself, this position that we take is not meaningful in as much as it is only a position that we are taking just for the sake of it. So whilst surviving and perpetuating itself forever is meaningful in a kind of sense of the word for the ego state, that type of meaning denies growth. So really it's kind of a perverse type of meaning, a self-denying type of meaning. It's like saying, if I am a heroin addict, the meaning of my life is to obtain good heroin whenever I need it. And when I'm a heroin addict, that definitely seems meaningful to me. It's got to, because it's basically the only thing I care about, so it's definitely meaningful. But at the same time, it's not exactly meaningful in any cosmic sense. It's kind of pretty boring. Because from the outside, here's a heroin addict trying to get more heroin. That's not particularly, it's not particularly fascinating. It's not a fascinating story. Here's a pickpocket picking pockets. Here's a crack addict smoking crack. I don't mean this in a moral sense. It's just all very predictable. It's not really meaningful. It's the lack of meaning, really, because in an addiction we prevent any other meaning happening to us because we're so committed to perpetuating our current situation. It kind of means that the ego is an addict. So all it cares about is itself and perpetuating itself. So meaning, if I can just get back on track there, meaning oddly isn't a positive thing that we assert. Meaning happens when we let go of everything we thought we know and everything we thought was important to us and see what happens then. And then what happens then, whatever it is that happens then, happens all by itself. We didn't contrive it. We didn't make it happen. And because it's happening all by itself, independently of our wishes, independently of our agenda, that's exactly what makes it meaningful. Like if it's happening not because of my plan for it to happen, then it's meaningful, which again is back to front to our normal way of looking at things. And so if we were to say that there is such a thing as meaning, and meaning can be used in lots of different ways, but we can use it in a psychological sense. That's to say that when our life feels fresh and interesting to us, not stale to us, and when it kind of mobilizes genuine passion rather than just the dead inertial force of habit, then we could call that meaning. And then in that case we can say, well, meaning comes about when we go beyond who we are or who we think we are or what the mind's picture of us is. So in that case, what we're saying is that meaning is really the movement beyond the known, and the movement beyond the known is just another long-winded way of saying movement, because the only type of movement there is movement beyond the known. If we don't move beyond the known, then we're not moving. So the whole of our activities within the game that we're playing, which is the extension of the ego state, or the linear progression of the mind-created identity, and all the things that mind-created identity wants to do or achieve, that isn't movement, because it's never getting away from itself. And instead of saying it isn't movement, we could also say it isn't change, because absolutely nothing is changing. The whole point of linear stuff, might be a better way of putting it, because I can pronounce it better. The whole point of linear stuff is that everything stays the same. It's an extension of the very same thing over and over again. So if you want to make a straight line, what you're basically doing is putting a point on a page somewhere and saying, okay, I'm just going to keep on putting points and repeat over and over again. So a line is a repetition of itself over and over again. It never deviates from itself or goes off track, and that's why it's a straight line. That's why it's linear, because it's a faithful copying and reproduction of the same thing over and over again. That's why it can be described in terms of a simple formula, because there's nothing to it really. It's a redundancy. So the whole of our life, when it is seen as being nothing else than the playground of the ego state, or what the ego state wants or doesn't want, is movement, what appears to be movement but that isn't movement, what appears to be change but isn't change. And what appears to be meaningful but is actually completely and utterly meaningless. Or as we could also say that the life of the mind-created identity, the concrete identity that is how we see ourselves and perceive ourselves, is at all times a perfect nullity, which is to say it's totally hollow and there's nothing in it. Thanks for watching.